Is from Honduras, and he's a professor at Calvin College. So welcome, Kurt. We're glad you're here. This is actually the second year in a row that Kurt's been here. He came here last year and was doing some fundraising. He's director of ASJ-US, which is an association for a more just society out of Tegucigalpa, Honduras. So maybe you'll explain how you live in Honduras and teach at Calvin College, and thank you, because that's pretty impressive to me. And so we've had him speak 2 years in a row at the Justice Seminar, and this year we've invited him also to share with all of you and give some vision and sense of the work that he is about in obedience to God's call for justice. So blessings and welcome.
Good morning. I was wondering how many people would show here with the time change, so it's nice to see you all, and I'm glad I made it on time too. It's been a really great weekend, and one of the great pieces has been the great music, so thanks to the musicians, and the flags were pretty great this morning too. So before I get started, just a little bit maybe about who I am. So Pastor said I was from Honduras, but when you look at me, I probably don't look like that, right? So I grew up on the south side of Chicago, went to Calvin College, graduated in 1986, and graduated in May, got married in May, and moved to Honduras in June. So 86 was a big year. May of 86 was a big month. So been in Honduras for the last 25 years. Worked for 6 for CRWRC, and in 1996, after I got my PhD, I started working for Calvin College, but I have the best of all jobs, where I live in Honduras year-round, and Calvin College sends me students to study in Honduras for a semester, so I don't have to go to any faculty meetings. And in 1998, largely as a result of the work with Calvin, I felt like I was being convicted to start an organization in Honduras working on justice and corruption issues. And so a bunch of our Honduran friends got together, and Joanne and I, my wife, and we started the Association for a More Just Society. So I work for Calvin. I'm on the board of ASJ-US. And maybe one other thing I'll mention, 2000, so 10, 11 years ago, Joanne and I and our 2 kids moved into Nueva Suyapa, which is one of at that time it was the most violent neighborhood in Tegucigalpa, and also the neighborhood we've been going to church for the last 25 years. So, yeah, that's a little bit about me. So I'd like to talk a little bit this morning about 2 Bible passages. First of all, I need a show of hands. How many of you know John 3:16? Somebody up in the balcony want to say it for me? Believe in him? Okay, I give you a B+ for that. But I think everybody's hand was up. Let's see. 1 John 3:16. Show of hands. How many people know 1 John 3:16 by heart? You know it. But do you know it by heart? Do you know it? You're close. I think I would give you an A+ for that, just because you're the only one who tried. So when we look at these 2 verses, isn't it interesting that we all learned the first and not the second? And when you see them, they're very, very similar, except for that last phrase. Right? John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whosoever believe in him should not perish but have eternal life. 1 John 3:16, this is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us. So how similar that first part is, but then there's that second piece. And it's really sad and kind of disappointing that we don't also all memorize the second one, and maybe not so surprising. And we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. Like, maybe we don't learn that one because that second part is the hard part. It's nice to remember the first part. It's not always so comfortable to remember the second part. So how are we all doing on that? How are you doing on that laying down your life part? And I think I can speak for most of us that most of the time we're not doing so good. Most of the time I'm not doing so good. And it's somewhat comforting that we're in good company. And a couple of my favorite passages that show that, first of all, maybe some of you remember at least, when Paul gets really upset with Peter. And Paul says, you know, Peter, when it's just Gentiles around, you sit down by the Gentiles and eat with them. But when some of the Jews shows up, Peter kind of slides away from the Gentile table and slides up to the Jew table. And Paul says, what's the deal with that? Aren't we all, there's no longer Jew nor Greek, right? And not only calls them out, he writes about it. And another famous passage in Revelations, John and God are talking to the 7 churches. I mean, these are the seven of the first churches in the world. You think they've all got it going pretty well. But John and God has harsh words for almost all of them. And maybe one of the harshest is the church in Laodicea, right? You're lukewarm. It's like bad coffee, right? I'm ready to spit you out. So from the very beginning of the church, it's not been easy to do this lay down your life part. Why is it so hard? I think there's at least, probably more, but I've been thinking about at least 2 things lately. First of all, we're afraid. We're afraid of losing our time. We're afraid of losing our prestige, our comfort. I mean, what will it cost me? What will it cost me to lay down my life? What am I going to have to give up? And we know that the Bible promises us it's more blessed to give than to receive. I think we just don't believe it. We don't live that way. We say it, but we don't live it. And not only are we afraid, but we're getting bombarded with messages every day that tell us the exact opposite. I mean, just watch TV for about 20 minutes, and every commercial will tell you to worry about your retirement, to worry about your comfort, that you are number one, that more is always better. And oftentimes the church's message looks a lot more like a TV commercial than Christ. The church's message is also saying, it's God who gave you all this stuff. The more you have is a sign that God has blessed you more. And we know that's not true. We know that while at times material blessings come from God, it's also clear in the Bible that material blessings, some material goods are sometimes what gets in the way between us and God. Read only the rich young ruler, right? But lots of other places where it's stuff that gets in the way of our relationship with God. Many times it's God who gives us the money, but it's us who decides what to do with it. We even say in church sometimes, you don't have to lay down your life. You don't have to give. You just have to be willing to. And I'm not even sure what that means. Like, it sounds right when I hear it, but then, what does that mean to be willing to but not to? It's like, how do I can't even grab that. And it's not easy for me either, this laying down your life stuff. Lots of times, and I'll talk a little bit more about it, I'm just a big chicken. Canadians say that too? I told you earlier we moved up to Nueva Suyapa, a very violent neighborhood. And a few months after we moved up, one of our next door neighbors was getting ready to go down and buy some vegetables that he peddled out of the back of his pickup. And 3 guys with ski masks, they called them the encapuchados, which means the masked men, were robbing him of his 20, 30 bucks he had in his pocket. And something went wrong, nobody's quite sure what, and they shot him in the head. Lives about a block and a half from my house. His kids went to school with my kids. And it was shocking, but what was more shocking is 2 days later, his wife showed up at my door. And she says, "We know who did it." In fact, not only do we know who did it, we have 2 witnesses who are willing to testify. But the neighbors say that the 3 bad guys have connections in the police. So we can't just go and report it. What should we do? And she came to me because I'm like this justice guy, right? And so I ought to be able to help her out. But I started talking to people, they're like, "No, we've heard the same thing. They got connections, so be careful. You know, you could get killed, or more likely this woman and the witnesses could get killed. So we'll help you find somebody else." And you know how that goes. Like, you're all excited about it at the moment, and you start making phone calls and stuff. But the longer it takes, the kind of more it goes to the back of your mind. And so we did try. We tried to make appointments. We tried to get connections with people. But pretty quickly, almost 3 months went by. And one night, one afternoon, I get a call from my wife, and she's like, "There's a helicopter over our house. And there's all kinds of cop cars." And what had happened is the 3 guys had killed an off-duty cop without knowing it. And the cops' partners ended up calling a bunch of other people, and there was a helicopter and all kinds of cop cars. They cornered the guys in a house. And they ended up knocking down the door, and they shot one. They injured another, and another, they killed one, shot another, and another ran away. And we ended up counting in those 3 months that from the time we knew who had done it until the time they killed the cop, these guys had killed 13 people. 13 men, most of them fathers. 13 families without kids. No, 13 kids, 13 sets of kids without dads. And I hadn't done anything. Like, how's that for laying down your life, right? And the Bible gives some amazing examples, like the saints, right? And as soon as I say the saints, you're like, "Well, I'm not one of those." But Stephen, first one that comes to mind, right? The first martyr. Isn't it interesting that the first martyr was a deacon? It wasn't one of the preachers that got killed. They didn't necessarily like the preachers, but they killed the guy who was helping the poor people. One of the first 7. And Paul, in 2 Corinthians 11:13, goes through his whole story. Like, I've been stoned, I've been jailed, I've been shipwrecked, Paul was all about laying it all out there. He's like, "You don't even have to pay me. I'm going to make tents because I don't want to take anything from you that somebody else might rather have." Like, I'm laying it all out there. I'm giving it all I got. And you remember, Paul was killing the first Christians. So I think probably all of Paul's life, he's trying to pay back all the bad he had done. and the church in Thyatira. John says, you still have your first love. That first passion you have hasn't waned. Like, that's the cool stuff. We all want to be more like that, right? We want to be more like Paul, more like Stephen, like laying down our lives, figuratively or literally. And we probably all have our moments, and I've had a few, not so bad at least. And to finish that story, about 2 months after these guys killed the 13, I was asked to speak to a group of pastors in Honduras, about 100 pastors. And they asked me to talk about justice. So I prepared the traditional justice talk. The church, God cares about justice. We need to do justice. Why aren't you doing justice? And at night, 3 in the morning, when God often talks to me, I was awake at 3 this morning too, actually, thinking about the sermon. I'm thinking about the talk I'm going to give, and I'm getting ready. And then my mind kind of went to the 13 guys that got killed. And then my mind went to like, yeah, Kurt, and what did you do? So you're going to go talk to these pastors about justice, but what about you? So I ended up flushing my whole talk down the toilet. And I rewrote it, and I just told this story. I said, this is how I screwed up. There are 13 families without dads. And I feel like I could have and should have done something. And here these pastors with 3rd grade, 6th grade education, I got a PhD, I got money, I got contacts. I didn't do anything. So we just started talking about it. Like, what can we do about justice? What does God want us to do? And at the end of that talk, I promised them, I said, the next time this happens in my neighborhood, I'm going to do something. I don't know what, but I'm going to do something. And I asked all of them to do the same. What is an issue in your community that you will promise to do something about? And about 8 months later, we had a group of 10 to 15 late teenagers who started out robbing with a knife, then robbing with guns, and then they started shooting people. And so we hired the 2 guys on the right there. The one on the right is a lawyer, and the one on the next to him is an investigator. He worked with the police. They're both Christians. They're both left working for the government because they were sick of it, too much corruption. And we hired them, and we said, what we want you to do is go into the neighborhood and find victims and figure out how we can keep them safe and get them to testify. And it took us 6 months. And in the end, we did. In fact, we got all sorts of victims that were willing to testify. And we've been able to keep them all safe. And let me tell you just about one case. This is Jaime. And Jaime is the guy who collects the bus fare on the bus. He goes up and down. You guys probably put the money in a box here, right? If you ever ride the bus in Abbotsford. But in Honduras, somebody goes around and collects the money. And so Jaime was a fare collector, and the guy who collects the money also puts the gas in the bus. So one morning, he had just put gas in, and 2 gang members come on the bus. And they say, give us all your cash. And he's like, oh, I don't have any. I just filled up the tank. Now you can guess, if you're the guy filling up the tank and gang members come on, what are you always going to say when the gang guys come on? I just filled up the tank, even if you haven't, right? You got it stashed away in one of the seats. So the gang members figure he's lying, and they shoot him in the head. But luckily, grace of God, he moved, and it ended up going in his upper jaw and through his tongue and out his lower jaw. Just made a mess of his jaw, but he lived. He was in the hospital 6 weeks, jaw wired shut, and he knew that one of his neighbors had gotten help from ASJ-US. So he ended up contacting us, and he couldn't talk, but he wrote who it was who had shot him. And he said, if you keep him safe, If you can keep me safe, I'm willing to testify. Before he got out of jail, we already had the guys arrested. Sorry. Before he got out of the hospital. He didn't go to jail. The other guys did, though. And about a year later, one got 18 years in jail, and another got 16. And he's still working in the same neighborhood, collecting fares. He's safe. He was brave. I mean, the bravery of him compared to mine is like night and day, right? He's the one who got shot. He works on a bus every day. He still does. And he was willing to say, we can't let this keep happening. And not just Jaime. 2005, there's 30,000 people in my community. There were 35 homicides. More than one homicide for every 1,000 people. New York City is 4 homicides for every 100,000. I mean, this level of homicides, it's above the levels in Iraq and Afghanistan, Colombia and El Salvador. I mean, it's off the charts. Look what happened in 2010. 8. Because of 2 people. 1 investigator and 1 lawyer. Partly because I screwed up. And partly because we tried to fix it. Because of Jaime laying down his life. And now the model that we have in Nueva Suyapa is the government is going to try and apply that same model in the next 7 most violent neighborhoods to see if the government can make it work. And the U.S. Embassy and the Spanish Embassy want to see if it works in Honduras. They want to send it to other countries, to Guatemala and El Salvador. I mean, wouldn't that be cool? Somehow repaying our debt to those 13 families. That this model can end up saving people all over Central America. That Jaime's bravery pays off in ripple effects all over. So what does this say then about 1 John 3:16? First of all, everybody's afraid, right? Jaime's afraid, I was afraid, we're all afraid what we're going to lose. It seems to me the only way that we can really overcome fear is through love. And my favorite Bible verse is 1 John 4:18. It's perfect love which drives out fear. If we love someone, we're not afraid. If somebody is going to attack my daughter who's 18 in my neighborhood, I will not be one bit afraid. I can tell you right now. The last thing on my mind is going to be fear. It's my love for my daughter drives out any fear I have. I will do anything to keep my daughter safe. That's a little glimpse of that perfect love God wants us to have. But it's very hard to love people you don't know. I don't even know how you could do it. Like, do you love people in Mozambique? Like, I guess so. You know, I don't know anybody there. I don't know how I would love. I mean, until you at least have a name and a face, a name and a story, it's hard to. But at the same time, it's hard not to love people that you do know. At least hard not to help them. Like, there could be somebody, the most annoying person that you work with or that you study with. And if they show up on your doorstep and they just had a car accident and they need somebody to take them to the hospital, like, how could you say no? Right? I mean, when you have that need right in front of you, you can't help. I mean, lots of times we get sucked into all sorts of things just because we know them. So it's very hard to love people you don't know. It's hard not to love people you do. And that has a huge implication. Like, who are we getting to know? Are we getting to know people who really need us? Or are we insulating ourselves from getting to know them? I just heard somebody said this week something to me. That grace is like water. It flows downhill in puddles in the lowest places. Like, are we getting to know people in those lowest places? Because as soon as we get to know them, we're going to help them. So lots of times we don't want to, right? But all we need to do is get to know them. And it'll just happen. We're going to end up loving on them, even when we don't want to. And we also have to struggle with our culture. And I've been doing reworkings of this all week, so we'll see how this part goes. My first version was kind of like, all of you have to give more. And I've been convicted all week that wasn't what I was supposed to say either. It's everything we have is God's. Right? Like we just miss that. All our money, it's all God's. We say, like, it's my money, it's my house, it's my car, it's my job, it's my family. Like, that's wrong. It's all God's. God gives it. We're stewards. How does God want us to spend it? That's the only thing we need to ask. How does God want us to spend our money? How does God want us to spend it? Is God happy? Does God want me to buy this car, this house, this whatever? And I'm messed up on this. You know, you take the collection. What happens to me? I have no trouble on a weekend going out with my kids. We go out for a movie. We get something to eat. We get some ice cream afterwards. Before I know it, I spent $50. Canadians say bucks. But if the collection plate's going around and the lowest bill I got in my pocket is a 20, I'm like, ah. And I'm not lying. I'm serious. Like, next week. You know, a 5 or a 10, that's good. And not a 20. I spent $50 last night on nothing. I don't want to put 20 in the collection plate. Somebody comes with this fabulous ministry they're involved in. $100. But we can book plane tickets for our family to go on vacation. $2,500 like that. But $2,500 to Nepal? No, come on. I don't got that kind of money. What do you mean you don't have that kind of money? Last night you were on Expedia. You spent $2,500 like that. You didn't even think twice about it, right? I didn't think twice about it. Our money, our time, our families, our lives are God's. And so I decided last night that I'm going to go home to my family and we're going to sit down and rethink this stuff again too. And we do it regularly, but it's been 2 or 3 years again. How are we spending? I spend too much time on my computer. I spend too much time on work. I got a daughter who's going away from college. And I might be wasting this last 6 months I have with her. Like, how does God want us to spend our time and our money and ourselves? Right? What does it mean to lay down? So I challenge all of us to do that. To this week, maybe today, maybe this afternoon, sit down and talk about it for a half hour. How are we doing with this, laying down our life stuff? And I'm convinced, and I have seen it in Honduras, that there will be 3 results. First of all, I think we risk little and we get little. We get a trickle of blessings. I like this image. God has this fire hose of blessings. And God is like, where do you want it? We're like, no, thank you. You know, just turn it down like the garden hose. Turn it down as low as you can. So I just need a few drips to keep me going. And God, just give it a little risk. Take a risk. And God's going to open that hose up, you know. And just a few examples of our work in Honduras. In 5 years, we've gotten 60,000 people titles to their land. People have lived 20 or 30 years on their property and didn't have a piece of paper. In 5 years, we've gotten 60,000 of them. We have Gideon Centers, which offer counseling and legal services to poor people. Over 6,000 cases resolved. Domestic violence, abuse. 21,000 people trained. And we have a whole very exciting thing that I won't talk about right now, where we got World Vision, Compassion, the Catholic Church, the Protestant Church all together trying to change the whole education system for the country. And it all begins with like one little step, one little risk. Like saying, I screwed up, and there's 13 people dead. I'm not going to screw up again. I don't know what we're going to do. Let's just try something. And those little efforts have turned into all of this. We have almost 70 staff people, all Hondurans, all Christians, all committed. 5 of them have gotten death threats in the last 6 months. Not one of them has quit. All of them were women. Not one of their husbands told them to quit. I mean, that's a miracle, right? God's got this fire hose of blessing. And all he wants is just lay down your life. Shane Claiborne has this quote, Christianity spreads best not through force, but through fascination. What would our lives look like if they were fascinating? This church would be full. How do we become fascinating to our neighbors? Doing things they don't expect. The German ambassador to Honduras was just in our office visiting our projects. And he said, I'm an atheist, but you guys are the most interesting Christians I've ever met. Like, that's a little bit of that, right? Like doing things people don't expect from Christians. Living different lives. And I also think that we think that laying down our lives is going to be bad. It's going to be hard. We're going to suffer. But I think we all know in our hearts, we've all even had a taste of it. It's the opposite. We end up living lives that are exciting and not always easy, but just full of blessings. Okay, I'm going to give you my one stupid example. I love my Sunday afternoon naps, right? I love them. Sometimes on Monday morning, I'm already thinking about my Sunday afternoon nap. That's how much I love them. And every once in a while on a Sunday afternoon, I just had lunch, it's about 1 o'clock, and then, oh, crap. You know? And people, like, they want to talk. And just recently, our neighbor came, and they had found a big black shadow on her kidneys. So she comes in, and we talk, and the whole first 10 minutes I'm thinking, okay, I hope we can make this short, you know? But Joanne makes coffee and tea, and we bring out the cookies, and we're talking about that, and she starts crying, and we start crying, and then we pray. And then the kids are there, and they're doing funny things, and then we start laughing, and we're talking about other stuff. And before you know it, it's 4 or 5 hours later. And I didn't get a nap, and I feel wonderful. Like, it's not always about doing these huge, difficult things. Sometimes it's just giving up a nap. And like how God can use those 4 or 5 hours. It's not just that I bless this woman, Suyapa, who has a shadow on her kidney. I ended up like a richer person. We moved into this rough neighborhood, and I thought it was going to be so hard, and it's fabulous. My kids love living there. It's not a sacrifice. We like it better than where we used to live in an upper middle class neighborhood. So we can bless others, and we will, in the end, be blessed ourselves. So, in the end, I'd like to challenge us all to think about how we're doing with that. How am I doing with laying down my life? How are you doing with laying down your life? And in the end, I think it takes at least three things. We need to pray, we need to risk, and we need to love. Amen.